I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Peter Ryan from the University of Cape Town. He's got a long association with the FitzPatrick Institute of African Ornithology, studying the impact of plastic ingestion on seabirds for his master's degree. And as we know, that's certainly where the intersection of recycling and the public spotlight on plastics has gained prominence over the last few years. Every second Facebook video is of a seagull caught up in plastic, or with fish that have ingested plastics, and dolphins and that kind of thing. But the big issue, and I think critically what we need, is evidence-based policy making. So with that, Dr. Peter Ryan of the University of Cape Town, a warm round of applause, everyone, for our first speaker.
Thanks very much. I forgot to ask how we're going to advance the slides. Here we go. Wonderful. Well, it's great to see so many people out here on a Friday. Thanks for coming. I got up at some ungodly hour to be here, so I should get brownie points for that too. So this is a fairly generic talk. It's the kind of talk that I give to broad audiences, so some of it might be perhaps not as on point as you might like. But as I was just mentioned, I've been doing this for a long time. I started working on plastics in the 1980s. That's me on Inaccessible Island in 1987. But I started in 1984 for my master's degree. So I have this quite long perspective. And because my focus was on plastic ingestion in seabirds, I wanted to know what was available on plastics in the ocean generally. And at that stage, there was basically nothing known about plastics in the ocean around South Africa. So we started sampling plastics on beaches. We scraped together what we could learn about plastics in the ocean. And we've continued that sampling over the last 30 years. So I have this rather long time perspective to the whole thing. And I was going to skip right over the slide because I figured most of you were in the plastics industry and appreciated the value of plastics. It was kind of surprising to see some people think you can't live without plastics. I think these days it would be very difficult to do that. You'd have to give up all of your fancy phones and computers and cars and airplanes. So we're currently in a situation where we have about 400 million tons being converted every year, and a little under half of that going into packaging. And obviously the big focus on packaging is around single-use, short lifespan. And the reason why we're so addicted to plastics is they have all of these wonderful properties. They're very versatile, they're relatively cheap. They're lightweight, which is good from a carbon footprint perspective. They have a long lifespan. They have great barrier properties, so they're wonderful for preserving food. But the same characteristics make them fairly effective pollutants. And so that's what we need to manage against. So you can't live without plastics. You've just got to manage them so they don't end up in the environment. And to give you some indication of why plastics are problematic, just if you look as you move from local sources out into more remote areas on the planet, the proportion of plastic by number increases, but particularly by mass it increases. So if you go out and, as somebody was just saying, if you go to a refuse dump, plastic is less than 10% by mass of what goes to landfill. Street litter, it's about 20% by mass. South African beaches, it's a little over half of the mass of rubbish on the beach. By the time you get to oceanic islands, if you go far enough, it's over 90%. And that's because it disperses well, because it's light, and it has this long lifespan in the environment. So we've reached a point now, after 70 years of mass production of plastic, where there's really nowhere on the planet you can go and not be exposed to plastic. And that's obviously a fairly distressing state of affairs. But does it really matter if there's plastic out there? And this is the most visible face of plastic in terms of impacts on the environment, the entanglement issue. And by and large, it's not a conservation issue, it's an animal rights issue. There are relatively few species that are significantly impacted by entanglement. Obviously, it's very distressing for those individuals that are, and it's not something we want to encourage, but there really are only a handful of species where we have good evidence that entanglement is a significant conservation concern, particularly the marine turtles, because they face so many other threats. But still, entanglement is a relatively small issue for turtles compared to the impacts of, for example, fishing. And most of the entanglement is coming from fishing gear, so it's a secondary consequence of fishing. There's issues around potentially increasing the amount of floating material in the ocean is allowing things that attach to floating material to become more common and spread more easily. it's moot as to how significant that is. I think a significant concern is if we continue to pump plastic out into the environment, we'll eventually reach a point where the seabed will become heavily polluted with plastic to the point that it starts to impede gas transfer, and that has significant implications for deoxygenation, which is something we want to avoid. It's one of the problems associated with climate change as it is. You're probably aware of Canfield Ocean situations. So that's a concern. Fortunately, the empirical evidence from South Africa is that at the moment, we're still very far from that. We have the lowest recorded density of plastics of any trawl survey in the world. The Northern Hemisphere generally is much worse off than the Southern Hemisphere. There's only a couple of studies from the Southern Hemisphere, but really very, very low densities, 3 items per square kilometer. And trawl surveys are obviously a bit dodgy. We've got students at the moment looking at ROV footage, also finding very low densities of plastic on the seabed. That's not to say that we're not putting large amounts of plastic into the system, at least sporadically. And to me, this is the biggest concern around plastics going into the ocean is the aesthetic impact. That's a beach south of Durban after a rain event. And clearly that has a huge impact on the local economy. Tourists are not going to want to go to the beach if they look like that. So a lot of effort has to go into cleaning beaches. Central government spends about 100 million a year on working for the coast, quite a controversial extended public works program. Municipalities spend money, NGOs, and increasingly just members of the public go out and clean beaches because they think it's a good thing to do. But the biggest concern from an environmental perspective is the ingestion issue, because this, unlike entanglement, which typically is a rare event, not affecting large numbers of individuals, can affect significant proportions of populations. So this is one of the sort of classic pictures that I'm sure you've all seen. It's not one of mine. This is from the North Pacific. It's a Laysan albatross. And this is an albatross chick that has never left its island. So it's been fed all that plastic by its parents, to the point where it's so full of plastic that it dies and doesn't get away from the island to go to sea. Fortunately, in our part of the world, the albatrosses don't eat plastic to anything like the same extent, but we do have some seabirds that do. So going back to the 1980s, there were a couple of species that had over 90% of individuals containing at least some plastic. Great shearwater is one of those. And this was the most polluted bird that I saw in my studies in the 1980s. So all of that plastic, most of which was industrial pellets in those days, came out of that stomach on the left of the little inset there. Fast forward 30 years, this is the most polluted great shearwater that I've seen ever. Had over 200 bits of plastic in it. Interestingly, you'll see there's very few industrial pellets anymore. It's all fragments of user items. So the industry, to some extent, has cleaned up its act with things like Operation Clean Sweep. It's not to say that it's perfect. Every time we do stormwater drain surveys in Pardon Island, we get industrial pellets washing into the sea. But relative to what it was like in the 1970s and the 1980s, the numbers of industrial pellets going into the sea are much less. Murray Gregory famously surveyed New Zealand in the 1970s, and he had beaches with 100,000 pellets per meter of beach. I mean, just mind-blowing. It's like plastic sand in New Zealand, of all places. Certainly, the surveys that we did in the 1980s, we would find pellets just washing up the whole time. Now, if you go to the beach, unless there's been a big spill like the one in Durban a few years ago, generally speaking, you actually have to look quite hard to find an industrial pellet. But that improvement in the situation has been more than offset by the increase in the amount of fragments of user items, so things that have been manufactured and then have been out in the environment long enough to break down into this so-called plastic confetti. And it's not just seabirds who suffer in this way. The whole suite of marine organisms ingest so-called microplastics, and this is a little baby loggerhead turtle which washed up on Cape beaches, and it died as a result of ingesting all of that plastic came out of it. It had so much plastic in it that it had blocked the cloaca and been forced up through the bladder, killing the animal. And this obviously has 3 concerns. The first one is the one we just talked about, physical damage and blockage of the digestive tract. Particularly for turtles, this is problematic. It leads to gas buildup and they can no longer dive, and that just stops them feeding and they starve to death. There's a problem with reduced food intake. If you've only got a limited stomach volume, you can't eat as much food at a single sitting, which is great if you're on Weight Watchers, but if you're a seabird, not so good for you because you want to maximize your foraging opportunities. So that's a concern. But I think the underlying concern for most people, and us as top marine consumers, anybody who consumes seafood, is this underlying concern that plastics are bringing toxic compounds with them. So most plastics are pretty biologically inert. They'll just pass straight through you, won't do you any harm. But some of them have specific compounds added, or they bring legacy pollutants. And so this is the sort of underlying concern around plastics being incorporated into food chains. The picture at the top there is just showing some specifically labeled plastic particles and showing how they get concentrated within filter feeders like that little mysid shrimp. And in parts of the ocean, some of the key trophic links in the food chain, like lanternfish and lightfish, these mid-water fish, quite high proportions contain plastic particles. And these bring two types of pollutants with them. The one are the so-called legacy pollutants, things that we know have significant biological impacts and that we've banned their production by and large under the Stockholm Convention since 1980. But they're still out there. They're so long-lived, they're still out there, and they're drifting around at sea, and they don't like seawater, they do like plastic, so they accumulate onto plastics. And then you get a whole suite of other things that we deliberately add to plastics to give them specific properties, like flame retardants, colorants, plasticizers, and those can also have biogenic properties. And when you see statistics like this, you start to get concerned. We had a student look at anchovies, sardines, red eyes, lightfish and lanternfish, 5 species of small pelagic fish off the Benguela. Virtually everything in the Benguela feeds on these things one way or another, directly or indirectly. 50 to 70% of them contain microplastics. But when you actually dig into that number, you find that 99% of those microplastics are microfibers. And if you can find somebody who can actually tell you what the microfibers are, you find that most of them are not actually plastic. So if you go and sample anywhere in the ocean, go grab a liter of water, you'll typically find between 1 and 10 microfibers within a liter of water at the surface of the ocean anywhere on the world. Makes very little difference where you are. They're uniformly distributed, if anything, at higher concentrations at higher latitudes. And the general assumption is that these things have come out of washing machines and that they are synthetic, nylons, polyesters, polypropylenes, and so on. In fact, it turns out that the vast majority of them are not synthetic. Most of them are cellulose-based, about 80% cellulose-based, 12% animal-based, and only 8% synthetic. And that's, again, uniform from the Southern Ocean to the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Indian Ocean. We don't really understand why these natural fibers are persisting so long in the environment, but that's where we are at the moment. So it's an area of ongoing research. But when people start giving you figures of how many billions of microplastics there are in the ocean, just think carefully, are they really microplastics? Are they talking fibers or are they talking particles? If they're talking fibers, there's a good probability that most of them are not actually synthetic. Some more good news is that the legacy pollutants that we were concerned about are going down because we've banned their use for some time. So this is just some trend data from 3 different beaches. Because we've been collecting pellets around the South African coast since the 1980s, we're able to analyze the concentrations on those pellets, and things are getting better, at least for the relatively short-lived legacy pollutants like lindane. And then a final piece of good news if you're worried about eating seafood is that it takes a while for those things that are attached to microplastics to move into the body of organisms. So if you're worried about eating a fish with plastic inside it, A, you don't have to worry too much because probably you're not going to eat the stomach of the fish. But if you are eating small fish whole, there's still not much chance that it's going to transfer too much into you directly from microplastics because it takes an order of days for those compounds to diffuse out of plastics into your body. And the rate at which they diffuse and the proportion that diffuses into your body is related very intimately to the chemical composition of the stomach content. Okay, so that's kind of the case for plastics in the environment, why we should be concerned. And as I say, to me, the biggest concern is the aesthetic one. Ingestion is an issue, but again, if you really dig deep, you're not going to find very strong evidence that it's having an impact on many populations except perhaps marine turtles. And if you're worried about microplastics coming into the human food chain, I'd be much more worried about heavy metals and other marine contaminants. Having said that, the thing about plastics, and the reason why I quite like working on plastics, is it's a wholly avoidable problem. It's not something that we really have to make significant compromises in our lifestyle to tackle. And so it should be something that we can solve fairly easily. So how do we go about solving the plastics in the ocean problem? Well, one suggestion is that we go out into the deep ocean and we clean up the ocean gyres. This is the buoy and slat model. The trouble with cleaning is it's just treating the symptoms. And you saw that graph right in the very first slide showing how plastic production is going up and up. If we just focus on cleaning out in the environment, we're not doing the best use of resources. We should be putting those resources into stopping it getting into the environment in the first place. Having said that, cleaning does make a difference. I was always a bit anti-beach cleaning, but I've come to realize that it really does make a significant difference. And you can see that difference. So over the 30 years that we've been doing beach surveys, we can see the amount of plastic on beaches sort of going down at the moment, which sounds paradoxical, but it's because beach cleaning is going up so significantly. So this is just some trend data for bags and bottles on South African beaches, and there's really no pattern for those big items. If you look at small things that people generally don't pick up, like lids, earbuds, and straws, you can see that the trend is upwards. And I could give you some more data on this, but it's not that important. But the really important reason why it's worth cleaning beaches is that the majority of the mass of plastic, everybody's focused on microplastics, but the mass is sitting in big things. And the advantage of big things is we can do something about it. Because once it breaks down into that sort of stuff, it's very difficult to do anything about it. And so this is why it's worthwhile going out and actually making the effort, once it's got into the environment, to get it back before it breaks down into microplastics. And this just gives you an indication of what happens if you leave large plastic items out in the environment for long enough. So this is a 28-year-old, 20-gallon cooking oil container that's been sitting on an island for, goodness knows, 20-odd years. And you can see that UV degradation has made it embrittled, and it starts to fragment and break down into microplastics. So if we'd managed to remove it before this happened, that would be a lot better outcome. Just as a little aside, it's widely assumed that plastics kind of last forever in the environment, that they're immune to biological degradation. It turns out that bacteria are slowly catching on to plastics as a food source, so there are now 2 bacteria that have been described, one targeting PET, one targeting polyethylene. And you might think this is wonderful, and I guess from an environmental perspective it is quite good, but think about the consequences if they start attacking the things that we don't want them to break down, like your cars and computers and so on. So this is maybe not something we want to encourage too much. So if we want to have lasting solutions, we need to tackle the plastics at source. So where is all this junk in the ocean coming from? And this is one of my horror pictures. It looks like what I call a Cape Flats wetland, but it's actually taken out of sight of land in the Straits of Malacca between Indonesia and Malaysia. So there are parts of the ocean that look really, really bad. So where is all that trash coming from? And when I started work on this problem, the fingers were pointing squarely out to sea. It was estimated in the 1970s that it was 7 million tons of junk being thrown off ships every year. Fortunately, at the end of the 1980s, MARPOL Annex 5 came into force, which banned the dumping of plastics and other persistent wastes from ships. And since then, the focus has very much shifted from ships to land-based sources, and you'll see this statistic everywhere. 80% of the plastic in the ocean comes from land-based sources. And probably that is broadly accurate, but it's not very well supported empirically. And if you go further away from source areas, you'll find that it's very far from the truth. So this is one of my favorite places to go and get away from people. Inaccessible Island in the middle of the South Atlantic. And this is what it looks like. There's nobody on the island, it never gets cleaned. And if you look at that, it's mostly fishing floats and big kind of containers that get tossed off ships. There's a life buoy there. And if you actually look at it in terms of mass, it's over 90% of the mass of litter is coming from maritime sources. What about the other sort of general junk? So the category of waste that's increased most rapidly over the last 3 decades on this island is drink bottles, PET bottles, just increasing at 15% per year. General rubbish has increased at about 7% per year. And interestingly, what's happened over the 3 decades that we've been going there is there's been a shift from South America as the major source, and South America is where you'd expect the litter to come from, as I'll explain in a minute. There's been a steady shift from South America to Asia. And the interesting thing is that most of those bottles come from China, and most of those bottles are less than 2 years old. So there's a really nice little web-based resource called Plastic Adrift, where you can put a little rubber duck anywhere in the world, and it will tell you where it will go to. So if you put a rubber duck on the east coast of South America, say Montevideo or Buenos Aires or Sao Paulo, after 4 years, that's where all the plastic will be. It'll be in the South Atlantic Gyre because that's where floating plastic accumulates. Unless it sinks and goes to the seabed, it's going to keep floating around and around in the South Atlantic Gyre. If you release it from China, it goes to the North Pacific Gyre. If you release it from South China or from Indonesia or somewhere in Southeast Asia, there's a proportion that will come around the Indian Ocean and go across the Agulhas Current. But it'll take at least 5 or 6 years to reach the South Atlantic Ocean. So there's no ways that these 2-year-old bottles from China are coming by drift. They're coming off ships. And that just shows the origins of bottles on this very remote place in relation to shipping routes. So most of the bottles are coming either from South America or from Asia. And that just mirrors shipping traffic across the South Atlantic. Over the last 20 years, we've seen a massive increase in shipping from South America to Asia to feed the tiger economies. What does this mean for South Africa? Well, we were quite excited by these findings. We thought we'd apply them in South Africa, so we went out and did bottle surveys all over South Africa, and this is just some data from the Western Cape. Obviously, when you come to a continent, you've got a complicating factor of local sources. So how do we control for local sources? We go out and see what's lying around on the street, and we also go into shops to see what's being sold. And generally speaking, 99% of street litter is South African-produced bottles. If you go down to Table Bay, it's more or less the same pattern. There's a 5-6% foreign component, but it's still basically South African bottles. But as you move away from the center of Cape Town to slightly more remote sites, you see the foreign component getting larger and larger. And by the time you get to really remote areas that people don't get to very often, most of the bottles are coming from offshore sources. So where do they come from? As I said, most of them come from South Africa. Tiny proportion from a whole potpourri of African countries, but the vast majority, again, coming from Asia. In fact, it's the same brands. So Nongfu Spring is, and there's what we call our friend, because we can't pronounce the Chinese name, but it's a Pepsi subsidiary water producer, and we just, it's our friend, because we see so many of them. So they are, after Coke, the top 2 brands. I've done this in the South Pacific, in Kenya, in South Africa, on inaccessible islands. It's the same brands occurring again and again. So what we need to do in this case is we need to go back and look at ships as a significant source, and we need to make sure that they're actually adhering to the regulations that they're supposed to. And I think most of the world's shipping is doing a reasonable job, but the Asian fleet clearly is not. And so we're pressuring the International Maritime Organization at the moment to try to step up their monitoring of port reception facilities, because that's the best way to really police this. If a vessel comes in after 10 days, 2 weeks at sea, it should be offloading a significant amount of waste. If it's not, there should be hard questions asked. Having said that, most of the waste definitely does come from land-based sources around the coast, and the reason we can say that with some level of certainty is if we look at the distribution of litter around the coast, this is what we see. We see halos of concentrations of litter around the 4 major urban centers, Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, East London, and Durban. And we see this whether we look at any category of litter, macro, micro, you pick your poison, I will show you the same pattern. For macro litter, you get this pattern even though we spend a lot more effort cleaning beaches close to urban areas. And indeed, South Africa, I'm sure many of you who are in the plastics world will be aware of this paper. It's a very embarrassing paper from a South African perspective. It suggests that somewhere between 5 and 12 million tons of plastic goes into the sea from land-based sources every year, and South Africa is listed as the 11th worst offender. So we're supposed to be putting in somewhere between about 100 and 250,000 tons of plastic into the ocean every year. And that's really embarrassing for a country of relatively modest population size. And the reason why we have such a high supposed footprint is because a very high proportion of our waste is mismanaged. And this is not a dump site. This is next to a dump site in Calvinia. And all of that litter, which made it to the landfill, didn't stay in the landfill. It all got blown out. And once it gets blown out, it ends up in watercourses and washes down to the sea unless it gets intercepted along the way. And so I've had students working on how much litter we actually are putting into the sea. This is Eleanor Weidemann doing a really nasty job of netting storm drains. She finds dead rats and feces and all sorts of lovely things washing out of storm drains in Cape Town. And the detail is not really that important. But the interesting thing is that Cape Town is probably putting, best estimate, about 500 tons of plastic into the ocean, which is a horrifying number, but it's certainly nowhere near the 30 to 100,000 tons that Jambeck paper suggests we're putting into the ocean. So I think, yes, we have a problem, but it's not as bad as some of the literature suggests. That's not to say we shouldn't do something about it, just saying it's not quite so bad. And this is some other interesting stuff that's just come out recently. So one of the problems with using beach litter to estimate what's going on is that as cleaning effort changes over time, and typically it's increasing and increasing, it's very hard to actually go down to the beach and judge what's going on, because what you see is changing the whole time. And if you don't understand how quickly it's turning over, it's very difficult to interpret the standing stock. So what you have to do is you have to look at what washes up every day. So it's a really tedious job, but we've done it a couple of times. And from 1994 to 2012, there was a threefold increase in the amount of litter washing up in Table Bay in Cape Town. Over that time, the human population increased by about 50%, so we were really outstripping human population growth. We got a student to do it again last year, and interestingly, it was a massive reduction, particularly in summer. And you might think, well, that's kind of surprising. And it is, because we're still pumping loads of litter into our wetlands. So that was a picture taken last year in Sandflay, and it's really horrific how much crap is going in. But what has changed is that the City Council is doing some interception now. So one of the major conduits is the Black River, pumping rubbish into Table Bay. This is not the boom on the Black River. It's just another picture I happened to take. It's actually in America, but there's a boom catching litter, and I think that's what's responsible. So we're intercepting the litter higher up. We're still not actually targeting the sources, but we're just intercepting it before it gets down to the beach. So how are we going to actually tackle the sources? And I think this is the subject of where we're going to spend the rest of the day. And you're all bored to death, no doubt, with reduce, reuse, recycle. There's no doubt we need to improve solid waste management. I mean, that 56% mismanaged waste, you can argue it, but it's still unacceptably high in this country. A large proportion of our population doesn't have curbside collection of litter. They don't have any formal way to get rid of their waste. And those people who do, most of it just goes to landfill, and that's unacceptable these days. We certainly need particularly enforcement to reduce littering. We've educated people to hell and gone, and they still litter. I think incentives are a really good way to change behavior. We'll talk a little bit about that. But I think maybe for this audience, what's really important is that we think carefully about our packaging decisions and design. So it's not just the 3 R's, it's the 4 R's. We need to rethink the way we do things. And if we don't, I'm afraid we're going to increasingly face consumer sort of refusal to accept. You know, there's this real groundswell of objection to over-packaging, excess packaging in plastic in particular. So a really encouraging development is the South African Plastics Pact, which aims to eliminate unnecessary packaging through redesign, innovation, or reusable delivery models, and I would encourage all of you to consider joining this pact. So it has some fairly ambitious targets that by 2025, 100% of plastic packaging will be reusable or recyclable. I think that's not an unreasonable suggestion. I think it would be better if we brought that down to maybe 2022. 70% of plastic packaging should be recycled, and 30% of recycled content used across all plastic packaging. So that's their goals. And obviously, if we embrace that kind of thing, we'll be going quite some way along this journey towards a circular economy. We have some industry-driven models that are doing fairly well. I think probably the best known one is the Petco model, which is recycling large amounts of PET bottles, my favorite things, saving huge amounts of landfill space, generating income for informal waste collectors, which is all very good and well. But what I say to Petco is, yes, you're recovering 2/3 of the bottles produced, but we produce over 4 billion bottles a year. So that's still 1 billion bottles either going out into the environment or into landfill. And so it's a start, but you need to do more. And there's lots of evidence around the world that just adding an explicit incentive, even a 5 cent in the case of US states, really improves your recovery rate. So we need to think more creatively about how we get that 60% recovery up to 80, 90%. And this is just, again, some data from our beach survey showing how the introduction of the much maligned levies for bags, yes, very badly managed, not a great system, but it had an immediate impact. I think the best way to change behavior is through fiscal incentives. The problem is you get people who say, ban the bag, but carrier bags are an insignificant proportion of the flexible waste that ends up on our beaches, 3%. So banning carrier bags will really have a minimal impact on the root cause of the problem. So really what we need to do is we need to rethink the way that the public interacts with plastic, and we need to make it easy for them to do so. So there's some nice initiatives. Polyco's got their million plus kind of idea. We're trying to get people actually out and recycling. The statistic that I heard a week or so ago was only 5% of South Africans recycle. I'm not even sure if it's that high. This was a really nice story. I was chatting to Alan Gray the other day, again, targeting you guys if you're sitting from an industry perspective. Alan Gray's head office in Cape Town, just one director got hutful with the waste situation. They got 1,500 employees in their head office. So he said, it's just unacceptable that all of our waste goes into a mixed waste stream and gets dumped. So for a week, he took all of the waste and put it in one room. Just said, dump it all in there. And then they brought it down to the foyer and they piled it up and said, this is what we produce in a week. It's unacceptable. And so what did he do? They took rubbish bins out of people's offices. No longer was it convenient just to throw everything into one bin. Now they have a recycling center on each floor. So if you have an apple core or a piece of paper or whatever you produce that you want to get rid of, you have to get up and walk and get fit and get your Discovery brownie points, and it goes and it gets sorted. And this is the kind of ethos that we need to embrace as a country. Sort at source is the way to go. And they've reduced their mixed waste by 95% just by that very simple measure. And the municipalities should be encouraging this kind of approach. We're running out of landfill space. The cost of maintaining and servicing the mixed waste stream is just insane. All of that stuff, once it's sorted, has value and can be used. But to do this with it is just madness. Having said that, I think there are certain applications where plastic should be effectively not used. Things that are very high risk, like straws, individual sweet wrappers. You've probably heard me do this before, but nipple caps, it's bad enough you've got a lid that you take off and throw away. Now you get the little lid that you take off and throw that away before you. It's just crazy. Earbud sticks, if you do any beach cleanups, you'll know earbud sticks are ubiquitous. Lollipop sticks, even worse possibly, polystyrene trays and so on. And we have this legacy in this country of actually banning things that we think are bad for the environment, like six-pack yolks and aluminium ring pull lids. So let's, top down, I know it's unpopular, but let's just ban the bloody things. And in those kinds of applications, there are potentially other things that we can use, so lots of different possibilities. I just want to kind of put a note of caution here that changing packaging can have potentially unintended consequences. So there's a sort of a move at the moment to maybe move away from HDPE packaging for milk. The HDPE recycling program is reasonably effective, 75% estimated, not sure how accurate that is. But the reason why it's so effective is it's a really valuable product. So there's a demand for it to be used in some of the detergent packaging. So there's a high value, and it's generating significant income for people. If you move to carton, you've got a much lower value, you've got a much lower recycling rate, and you've got a much lower generation. So you might be appeasing the public who think plastic is bad, but you're actually having a net negative to the environment because you're sending way more stuff to landfill. And you're making life difficult for people like Unilever who want to use 30% of that HD in their detergent packaging. And then just finally, a little word on degradable plastics. Again, I'm hopefully speaking to the converted here, but there's probably some of you who go out and buy Bonnie Bio bloody dog bags. So degradable plastics are a whole host of types of things, and you can't treat them all as a single, just as you can't talk about plastics as a unit. You shouldn't really be talking about degradable plastics. So they're oxidegradable ones, which are really bad news because they're just ordinary plastics with weak chain elements to break down into microplastics quickly. So that's the worst thing we can do. And then the so-called bioplastics, like PLA, which is the Bonnie Bio stuff, you need to really think carefully about what's going to happen to those. So most of them are only industrial compostable. I've got a Bonnie Bio poop bag that somebody kindly left on the beach. People seem to think that the dog can poo in it and then they can just leave it, and by then 3 minutes later it will evaporate. But it's, and I've had one in my compost heap for 6 months now, and it still is as tough and rigid, and it's just still perfect, basically. So industrial composting requires closed loop systems. We can't even manage our solid waste as it stands at the moment. Now we're going to have a separate solid waste collection for these products. It's just crazy. So don't fall into the trap of thinking that this is going to solve all your problems. Okay, so to kind of getting towards the end, just to finalize what I've been saying so far, I think as producers of plastics, you really need to think about the way that you're using plastics to make it as user-friendly as possible, to actually make sure they enter some kind of circular system and that they don't end up either in landfill or the environment. So we need extended producer responsibility. It's no longer good enough for you to worry about the product to point of sale. You need to worry about what happens beyond the point of sale. As consumers, we all need to demand better packaging options, and the government really needs to come to the table and help along. So in some ways they can do this by leveling the playing field, by top down, but at the municipal level, that's where the biggest efficiency is as far as I'm concerned. And the good news is that we are the captains of our own fate in this regard, with the exception of the ship issue offshore, which is a relatively small issue. Most of the litter that we experience in our environment is from our own local sources, so if we sort it out, we'll reap the benefits. Okay, so I could leave it there, but if I can abuse my time for just 2 more minutes, I want to put the plastic problem in context. So there's no doubt that we have a problem, and as I say, it's a tractable problem. It's one that we can deal with, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's gained so much traction, is because people feel they can relate to it and make a difference. But we also need to think, how serious a problem is it? Because there are a whole host of problems. And if we're focusing all of our effort onto worrying about plastics at the expense of some of the other problems that we face, we're not doing ourselves any good in the long term. And this was brought home to me last year when I was crucified in social media for wanting to do an experiment releasing plastics down rivers to see where they went. People said, you're deliberately polluting the world, and this is just the most heinous thing possible. And I had reasonably intelligent people telling me that plastics were the biggest environmental threat we faced. And I kind of wondered where this came from. And I think it's because of overhyping in the media. And there's just selective reporting. So just one example. So one of the classic statistics that you'll see is that there's more plastic than zooplankton in the North Pacific garbage patch, 6 times more. And that was a figure from a paper by Charles Moore. In fact, the paper said there was 5 times more zooplankton, but the plastic weighed 6 times more than the zooplankton. So they selectively picked the fact that the mass was more, not the number. But you have to recognize that this was sampled the top 10 centimeters of the water column. The zooplankton is distributed throughout the surface waters, whereas the plastic is concentrated right at the surface. So inherently, you're going to bias towards sampling plastics. So it's not fair reporting. And this was another one that came out last year. We're eating a credit card a week of plastic. And I was like, no ways, it's completely impossible. So I dug into it a little bit, and this is where it was coming from. Most of it was from drinking water. And the latest statistics suggest that, yes, if you drink bottled water, plastic bottled water, you will get quite a lot of microplastics. And you might get some from seafood and beer and salt and so on. But the microplastics that you're getting in bottled water and in other food sources are really, really small. And the WWF report used this environmental average of 2.8 milligrams, which is the size of a sesame seed. And if you were drinking a glass of water with 20 sesame seeds floating around in it every time you had a glass, you would notice. So, it's just bad science, and it's really frustrating. And there is kickback within the scientific community against this kind of hyperbole. So this was a conversation piece that came out saying, yes, plastics are getting more, but actually the evidence is not that strong that they're doing things that are bad for the environment. It's avoidable. Yes, get rid of it. I'm not saying don't deal with the problem, but don't deal with it exclusively at the cost of other things. So if you look at the planetary boundaries issues we face, plastics does not feature there. We face many more significant issues than plastics in the environment. And this is the message from this paper by Stafford and Jones, which I can kind of identify with, which basically says that we face a really severe climate crisis. We need to do something. The window of opportunity to do anything is narrowing. And if we are being distracted by plastics from actually tackling that problem in any way, then that's a bad thing. And so just to put that in context, the root cause of all our problems, of course, is there are too many people on the planet, and that is the continent by continent projection for the next 70, 80 years, and that I regard as the second scariest figure I'll show you today. Over 4 billion people in Africa by the end of the century. That's a very scary statistic, and one that we need to worry about and do something about. It's much more scary than straws on our beaches. And that's the scariest statistic. The fact that the CO2 curve is not slowing down at all. If anything, it's accelerating. And we shot through 400 parts per million willy-nilly 4 years ago, and we continue to go up. And you chat to the glaciologists, they will tell you that when we go above 400 parts per million, historically, we have lost the ice sheets in Greenland and West Antarctica. And it's not a question of if, it's a question of when we will see catastrophic sea level rise. So these are the kind of problems that we really should be focusing on and not worrying that much about plastic. So if we look at a 5-meter sea level rise, we've got 300 million people looking for a new home. Twice the area of South Africa disappears underwater. That's scary. And that could be 50 years away, it could be 100 years away, we just don't know. But that's what we should be preparing for, and that's what we should be trying to avoid. We still have a very small window to actually do something about this. And I think people see this kind of dichotomy between economic growth and sustainability, but it's not an either-or. It's really, we can only embrace the sustainability path. If we try to go rampant economic growth, we're just going to accelerate down the climate change crisis, and we're going to fall off the cliff. So that's my kind of contextualizing the problem for what it's worth, and hopefully it's been an interesting perspective. Thank you very much.
Dr. Ryan, thank you very much. I think some fantastic contextualizing of the issues and the problems, and I'm not going to ask you where your shoes went. I'm going to go into more pertinent questions around your last point, and that is to better understand the carbon footprint, I guess, of the various packaging options that we have available to us, and how much evidence-based research do we actually have or do into the carbon footprints of the alternatives and the other options, if CO2 is the number one challenge?
Yeah, I'm not the right person. I'm sure there are better qualified people in the audience here who can talk to that. I mean, it's a complicated equation. There's a fair amount of energy goes into producing plastics, but they are lighter typically than the alternatives. So it's a difficult equation. I'm sure through the day we'll hopefully pick up on that. I'm looking forward to learning myself where that equation lies. I suspect it's not a simple answer. Like all these things, there will be some applications where plastic is definitely the best, and there'll be other applications where perhaps it's not the best.
Right, let's go to Slido, and I would encourage the audience to participate and ask questions via Slido. It's just easier than sending a mic around, and we can also aggregate and upvote the questions that we most feel are pertinent to the conversation. The first one, there's an intense amount of lobbying by the plastic industry. Have you seen this take on a more genuinely concerned position, or does it remain fairly self-interested? Over the course of your career, as you said, you've been doing this since the mid-'80s.
Yeah, I think it depends what you mean by the plastics industry. That's also a kind of a multifarious beast. So certainly when I first got into this field, I think there was quite a lot of resistance from packaging. So Patco was quite, sort of not prepared to engage. But the Plastics Federation, which became Plastics SA, was very supportive of the work we were doing and actually encouraged us to expand our surveys beyond what we were doing. So they've supported our beach surveys sort of every 5 years since then. I don't feel any conflict in that regard because I don't really have any vested interest. It's just a way to do the work. But I think, I certainly haven't from the plastic converters side, I haven't seen a lot of objection, but more from the packaging type people.
Interesting to see, and this is what this conversation is about, how the various role players stack up in terms of finding a solution. On the issue of the science, and perhaps the science being far too emotionally driven, do you feel you have a duty to be more vocal and visible about challenging your colleagues in academia about this?
Well, I am fairly vocal. I work in various UN groups, the GASAMP working group I'm a member of, I do the best I can. It's a difficult space because there's a lot of hysteria, and I don't think the academics are particularly the problem. It's more civil society and the media who twist what the academics are saying.
And being part of the media and the big bad fourth estate, and I tend to agree with you. I think, unfortunately, as newsrooms have come under pressure, sensation sells, and also the quality of journalism has declined because they're just fewer journalists covering a more broad array of different beats where you used to have specialists in their field. So what would be your suggestion to try and counter that narrative, to try and get a more balanced, evidence-based approach in the public square?
Giving talks like this, I guess, so I'm primarily a bird biologist. I'm supposed to be saving seabirds, not giving talks about plastics. But over the last 2 or 3 years, I seem to spend more time talking about plastics and working on plastics than, just per force. So I'm doing the best I can, producing students who, are actually generating real data and then sharing those data with as broad an audience as possible to point out that, it's also kind of walking a line to some extent. You don't want to put the message across that plastics aren't a problem. So, it's a problem, but it's not the worst problem. And we don't want to discourage people from doing the right thing, which would be to, encourage producers to promote the whole recycling and we know where we want to be, and we need civil society to push in that direction. I think if there wasn't that response from civil society, maybe this meeting wouldn't be happening, and maybe we wouldn't see the kinds of change that we are seeing. So it's again, all these things are nuanced.
Balance. I was chatting to Sim Shabalala, the CEO of Standard Bank, yesterday. Were it not for the Wraith Foundation and Just Share applying pressure at the AGM last year, probably wouldn't have had access to their coal funding policy, first South African bank to do so. They've also said that there's a trade-off, though. We need power. Unfortunately, that's a reality of South Africa and Africa. So how do you mitigate, the negative impact of burning coal versus the need for power? So it is a complicated conversation, but we are heading in the right direction. I think, Nico, your point earlier was this is a journey. It's not an end destination. Just on a fairly technical question, have you benchmarked Petco and Polyco recycling rates versus similar organizations abroad, and how are we according to the global averages? Where are we?
Again, it's not really my field. I'm, buck and spade ecologist. I like being on the beach, so I don't really read other people's reports massively. So according to Petco and Polyco, they're doing wonderfully, and whether they are or not, I'll leave it to the there are people like Pippa Notton who worry about these things.
Fair enough. Dr. Peter Ryan, a warm round of applause, everyone. Before you go anywhere, I've got a small gift for you. Just to say thank you, and please recycle when you're done with that. Lovely South African wine.